Good morning. How are you? This is literally, as I get my reference points here, this is the fourth tape for the third testing period. In fact, last time we were talking about the progressive movement in Texas, and in truth, progressives were reformers. But the same reformers that believed in improving government, making it more efficient, considering boards and commissions of state government so that government could be more responsive to the needs of the people. Progressives were in fact reformers, but the same progressives were xenophobic. They feared foreigners. They supported segregation of the races. In fact, progressives could be violent and engage in race baiting, always reminding voters that if the voters didn't do as the progressives wanted, that you might have a second coming of black reconstruction once again in Texas. These progressives saw little difference in social reform and social control, and hence they supported the poll tax, primary laws, etc., that had socially controlling aspects about it. So the progressives were good people in the sense of improving the standard of government, but they saw no inconsistency in the fact that their progressive responses did not extend to the various races of man, including blacks, Hispanics, women, etc., in the state of Texas. But there were two other aspects of progressivism that were important to Texas, and that was the conservation of East Texas forests and the development of good roads in order to promote better commerce and education and business within the state of Texas. Environmentalists like W. Goodrich Jones, a Temple banker, supported the reforestation and regulation of the East Texas lumber industry after the turn of the 20th century. As an organizer of the Texas Forestry Association, Jones promoted policies of selective cutting of timber and reforestation and urged a Department of Forestry for the state of Texas. The legislature created such an agency, and Eric O. Sieke, S-I-E-C-K-E, Eric O. Sieke, from 1918 to 1943, brought professional forestry methods to East Texas. However, Texas never mandated the planting of one seedling for each mature tree cut, and with World War I increasing the cost of lumber, little conservation occurred, causing the destruction of old-growth East Texas pines. Indeed, the piney woods of East Texas of today are essentially reforestation efforts, and that the old pines in East Texas have essentially been destroyed. You can't find very many large pine trees except perhaps on the campus of Nacogdoches, of East Texas State at Nacogdoches today. Some of those pine trees are still original to the original pine forests of East Texas. The Texas Good Roads Association, relative to the promotion of improved roads in Texas, organized in 1911 with the intent to educate the citizenry on the value of good roads. But good road advocates grew in direct proportion to the number of automobiles in the state. And obviously, as more automobiles entered Texas, there was a growing desire for better roads upon which these newfangled automobiles would operate. What Good Roads advocates advocated or supported was centralized authority for the planning, building, and maintenance of Texas state highways. Since at the turn of the 20th century, what little road building was being done was done by Texas counties in a haphazardous method. Each Texas county, the average Texas county, operated and constructed roads operating and emanating outward from the county seat to the edge of the county. There was little or no coordination with surrounding counties about where roads would extend to the county line, and therefore you could have two contiguous counties with a county seat of one bringing a road up to the edge of the county here, and another one bringing the edge of a road up to the county line here, and thus having a divide, a section where roads were not would have to be oddly structured to connect those two roads emanating from the county seats of each Texas county. There was little cooperation, little coordination between the individual counties, and that's what sparked the Good Roads movement in Texas, because there were 254 Texas counties, and each were building roads in a haphazardous method, and there was no centralized planning institution that would plan and let alone build and maintain Texas highways. In 1916, the United States Congress passed the Federal Highway Act of that year, the Federal Highway Act of 1916. And for the first time, the United States Congress offered money, approximately $100 million, to states to join a national highway system. This countered the historic federal belief and objection that national funds ought to be used solely for roads and projects within a state, a view that was first held by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson opposed internal improvements extending from one state to another, and as a result, for a long time, the U.S. government refused to get into the business of interstate building of projects like roads. But the new law, called the Bankhead Act of 1916, stipulated that eligibility for federal funds required that each participating state that was going to get federal funding under this 1916 Act had to have authority vested in a state highway department. The state of Texas in 1916 did not have such a state agency because, again, there was no state agency. There was no coordination with counties individually building Texas roads. Funding was to be allocated on a formula based on existing state population, the overall size of the state, and prior road building collective efforts made in each state. And the truth is that Texas was one of the largest populated states of the Union. Until 1959, it was the geographically largest state of the Union. And given all of the prior county building efforts, Texas ranked first in prior efforts to build roads, even if it was uncoordinated by the counties. So it was a crying shame that Texas was not eligible in 1916 for federal funds. So what did Texas do? The legislature in Texas, after 1876 and the adoption of our current state constitution, legislature meets every other year in odd-numbered years. So in January of 1917, the Texas legislature convened, and House Bill 1, the very first act of the Texas legislature in 1917, created a Texas Highway Department, which would be governed by a 3-member commission appointed by the governor, whoever was governor in 1917. The commission was empowered to hire a state highway engineer to consult and advise on plans submitted by individual counties. Early commissioners did not cooperate, nor did counties in planning their roads. Finally, in 1924, in what was called the Limestone County case, in 1924, the Texas Court of Appeals ruled that the legislature should designate the Texas Highway Department as being solely responsible for both the building and the maintenance of Texas roads. And it was after 1924 in the Limestone County case that the legislature then restructured the Texas Road Commission granting the governor, whoever the governor was going to be in 1925, the power to name a new three-man road commission, Texas Highway Commission. This turn of events proved tragic for Texas because in 1924, Miriam Amanda Ferguson, the wife of impeached Governor James Edward Ferguson, ran for governor of Texas and was elected. And that meant that Mrs. Ferguson was governor in 1925, and she promptly appointed political cronies of her husband Jim to the commission. Soon rumors of financial mismanagement abounded. The truth is that Fergusonism, rule by Jim and Miriam Ferguson, started in 1914 when the then politically unknown Temple banker James Edward Farmer Jim, as he was called, or Pa Ferguson, was elected governor of Texas. Ferguson was reelected in 1916. He was politically wet. He supported the consumption of alcohol while being a personally dry governor. He didn't drink himself, but he supported the wets in this prohibition question. He was a champion. He considered himself a champion of the poor rural tenant farmers, which he referred to as the boys at the forks of the creek. And in his first and second administration, Jim Ferguson had substantial record of progress. But unfortunately, he alienated University of Texas supporters. The governor had little use for educated persons because he himself was self-educated as a lawyer and a successful businessman. Jim Ferguson quarreled with the University of Texas over university appropriations in 1916, and the governor of Texas finally demanded the dismissal of UT president and several faculty who had campaigned against him in 1916. To punish the university, in June of 1917, Governor Ferguson vetoed the UT summer school appropriation for the second semester summer of 1917, and that incurred the wrath of the Texas Exes Association, which immediately began to investigate Governor Jim Ferguson and soon discovered questionable business transactions, specifically that as the owner of the Temple State, the chief stockholder in the Temple State Bank, that Governor Ferguson had deposited state funds in the Temple State Bank, and that he had accepted, apparently, a $156,500 campaign contribution from the Texas liquor interest to help him get reelected in 1916. In 1917, the Texas House of Representatives impeached Governor Ferguson, and the Senate, by Senate trial, convicted Jim Ferguson and removed him as governor of Texas. One of the punishments of being removed as governor of Texas is that the state legislature banned Jim Ferguson from ever running and holding state office ever again. Ferguson first claimed that he had resigned before the Senate could vote him out of office, and therefore in 1918 he tried a write-in campaign for governor, claiming that he had resigned before he had been impeached. In 1920, Jim Ferguson ran as an independent candidate for the United States presidency, and he garnered over 100,000 votes in Texas. And then in 1922, he lost a hard-fought United States Senate race to Earl Mayfield, who was the Klan-endorsed and Klan-backed and successfully elected candidate against Jim Ferguson in 1922. In 1924, Ferguson then decided, okay, he would accept that he couldn't run for office again, but that wouldn't prohibit him from running his wife in his place. And so Miriam Amanda, M.A., Miriam Amanda, Ma Ferguson, Ma and Pa Ferguson thus were born. and the two of them stumped the state for Miriam Ferguson as governor in 1924. Ma did very little of the talking. Pa would introduce her and give a long introductory speech, and then Mrs. Ferguson would get up and she would ask her husband's admirers and supporters to help redeem her husband's good name. And the one thing she did do was to oppose the Klan, and she ran against Felix Davidson and defeated him. Surprisingly, Mrs. Ferguson was elected. So it became her choice in 1925 of naming a new state highway commission, and she would appoint staunch supporters and friends of her husband, Jim Ferguson, to the Texas Road Board. Before we talk about the end of progressivism, we need to talk about Texas during the First World War. The impeachment of a Texas governor took place in early 1917, just at the moment that the United States would enter the First World War. Texas would play a prominent role in world affairs through the administration of President Woodrow Wilson. Remember that it was the Texas delegation in Baltimore in 1912 at the National Democratic Convention that abandoned then United States Speaker Champ Clark of Missouri and shifted Texas's support to Woodrow Wilson, causing a landslide of support to Wilson and ultimately his nomination. Indeed, the 40 delegates to the the National Democratic Convention are known in Texas history as the Immortal 40, or their opponents used to call them the Immortal Farts of 1912 because they had backed away from Champ Clark and supported Woodrow Wilson. But because Texas has supported Woodrow Wilson's nomination as the Democratic nominee for the presidency, Wilson never forgot who brought him to the dance, so to speak. And immediately, President Wilson named Thomas Watts of Austin as the Attorney General of the United States. He named David Houston of Texas as the Secretary of Agriculture. Albert Sidney Burleson of Austin became the Postmaster General of the country, and Thomas Love of Dallas was appointed the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. And Colonel E.M. House of Austin, Texas, became one of the most trusted political advisors to Woodrow Wilson. Other Texans during this time became prominent. United States Senator Morris Shepherd became known as the father of the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And it was at this time that Representative Sam Rayburn of Bonham, Texas, was elected to the House of Representatives. Sam Rayburn would eventually become a 30-year-long Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. While Texans looked to Wilson for reform, they also loyally backed him during World War I. 200,000 Texans served in the armed forces, with 5,000 plus Texans killed in the Great War, the First World War. Within the state, thousands of soldiers were trained at 4 large military facilities located in Waco, Houston, San Antonio, and Fort Worth, with virtually all officers of the Army trained at Leon Springs, and Army Air Corps candidates trained at Kelly Field in San Antonio, Texas. Texas led the nation in flight training, with Randolph Field literally becoming known as the West Point of the air. Texas A&M was urged to grant departing ROTC juniors and seniors their degrees early in order to so that they could enter the service to serve the United States military during the First World War. A sanitarium for veterans was eventually set up in Kerrville for those veterans of the First World War who had been gassed along the Western Front. And 240 Texas counties and approximately 15,000 community councils of defense were organized to hold bond drives, Red Cross donations, promoting patriotism and remaining alert for any disloyal enemy activity within the state. Cooperating with these was the Federal Food Administration, whose job it was to limit civilian consumption of essential commodities like flour and meat, sugar and fat. And indeed, the Federal Food Administration, operating in Texas and throughout the United States, promoted wheatless Texas Mondays, meatless Texas Tuesdays, etc., for the war effort. In the face of the war, Texas government expenditures increased dramatically, as did inflation during the war years. In 1913, Texas government expenditures totaled $13 million in 1913. But by 1919, expenditures had doubled to $27 million. One other change was significant. Women, during the First World War, provided much of the labor needed for the war effort. This, in turn, assisted the women's suffrage movement. And in 1918, the Texas legislature granted suffrage to women so that they could vote in all state primaries. And Annie Webb Blanton, B-L-A-N-T-O-N, won the state superintendent of education race in Texas. While Texas voters rejected a state constitutional amendment granting women suffrage for the general election in 1919, the issue of women's suffrage was decided nationally. After the United States Constitution was amended giving women the right to vote, another session of the legislature in 1919 ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, making Texas the first southern state to grant approval for women to cast the right to vote. Racism did exist during the First World War, despite 25% of all soldiers being black. In fact, Texas minorities loyally participated in bond drives, supported the Red Cross, etc. Yet, at Huntsville, Texas, during the First World War, for evading the draft, a black man and 6 of his family were killed. And in Houston in August of 1917, in the heat of the Texas summer, before air conditioning, race riots killed 17 blacks in Houston. The war also enforced conformity, restricting criticism of government, denying suffrage to those foreign-born, non-naturalized citizens, forcing English to be spoken in the public schools. The legislature mandated that 10 minutes a day be devoted to the study of patriotism, and the legislature mandated that the U.S. flag had to be displayed in every Texas schoolyard. Governor William Hobby, the governor that replaced James Ferguson after his impeachment, Governor Hobby in 1919 even vetoed the appropriations for the German department at UT on the grounds that the elimination of such courses would promote purer Americanism and purer Texas values. Crusading patriotism more than once begat intolerance during this period. After the war, complacency set in. In February of 1918, the Texas legislature, Texas Legislature Investigative Committee, suggested the need for widespread reform of the Texas government. But nothing was done except to create a state board of control as a budget agency. Too often, the legislature proposed changes to government, including the need for a new constitution for Texas, but voters would reject the proposal. Proclaiming that a new democracy was needed within Texas, Pat Neff in 1922, Pat Neff, N-E-F-F, a Waco lawyer, a devout Baptist, and a former Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, defeated former Texas United States Senator Joe Bailey and became governor. Neff advocated a graduated land tax and other radical proposals. However, a non-responsive legislature did not assist Governor Neff. Neff did reform the pardoning procedures involved with prisons, standing in sharp contrast to the liberal policies, parole policies by Bill Hobby and Jim Ferguson. And Governor Neff promoted highway development with the creation of the Texas State Park System in 1923. It is a sad but true statement that Texas, that once owned millions of acres of public lands, had to solicit donations of acreage with which to begin its state recreational park system back in 1923. In fact, the first roadside park was established in LaGrange shortly after 1923. Symbolic of the intolerance and indifference in Texas after the First World War was the Ku Klux Klan and the fundamentalist evolutionist debate. Having revived itself in Georgia in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan reappeared in Texas by 1921, primarily as a means to impose social and moral conformity on a people transitioning from war. Hiram Evans, E-V-A-N-S, a Dallas dentist, became the Grand Klan leader of Texas. The motto of the Ku Klux Klan was 100% Americanism, which meant in Texas that the Klan supported law and order at a time when Governor Neff publicly denounced the lawlessness of the state. But 100% Americanism meant support for women, chastity, marital fidelity, respect for parents, abstinence from alcohol, etc. But 100% Americanism also meant that the Klan was anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant, anti-black, etc. And there were numerous cases of whipping and tar and feathering done on Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas in the 1920s by overzealous Klansmen enforcing, quote, 100% Americanism. In 1922, Klansman Earl Mayfield was elected to the United States Senate, and in 1924 the Klan supported Felix Robertson in the Democratic primary. That was a primary in which Jim Ferguson ran his wife Miriam. The Klan's power was setting because of vigilantism done by the Klan, and Mrs. Ferguson defeated Robertson in May, and then Republican George Butt, B-U-T-T-E, in November, become the first Texas female governor. The Texas legislature in 1924 passed an anti-mask law which challenged the authority of the Klan, although the Texas Supreme Court ruled in late 1924 against the anti-mask law since, quote, all masks, therefore even Halloween masks, would be illegal. And so the Supreme Court backed away from the anti-mask law of 1924. Although the South went along with conformity and control, came a resurgence of religious fundamentalism, given the dominance of the Baptist and Methodist in Texas and throughout the South. Fundamentalist Baptists, such as Mrs. Howard Butt, the founder of HEB, was a very strong fundamentalist. And fundamentalism literally allowed ministers to decry progress that took people out of their churches and challenged their religious values. For instance, automobiles, according to the evangelist Billy Sunday, were no more than, quote, what he called rolling houses of prostitution, which encouraged enhanced sexuality among teenagers, allegedly going parking during dates, etc. Churches promoted Sunday blue laws in Texas, forbidding jazz after midnight, and some cities even restricted the type and mode of bathing attire in the 1920s. In this atmosphere of conformity, Protestant sects and other religious associations promoted the study of creationism in the public schools. And in 1923, the first of several attempts to pass anti-evolution laws failed in the Texas legislature. Texas, like 5 other southern states, never passed an anti-evolution law. But when Governor Miriam Ferguson was governor in 1925 and 1926, Mrs. Ferguson, who happened to be a Methodist, a fundamentalist, sat with the Texas State Textbook Committee, and when the Texas Textbook Committee was considering textbooks, and Mrs. Ferguson would look at science and biology texts, and she literally carried a razor blade in her bag, and Mrs. Ferguson would excise, cut out of books, evolutionist statements from science textbooks, and then turn to the representatives of book companies and say, if you'll take that rot out of your science textbook, then we will allow you to sell your textbook in the state of Texas. And just as Texas State Textbook Association adoptions are prominent today because Texas has such a large population, that publishing companies don't want to publish a Texas science text. They just want to publish a text that is national in scope. So the Texas Textbook Commission today exercises exordinate control over what goes into textbooks in the state of Texas, and it did even in the 1920s when Miriam Amanda Ferguson was governor of Texas. What we want to do now is to end this tape. This is the 4th tape of the 3rd testing period, and when we come back, we'll look at the waning, the end to the progressive era. Have a good day. I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Bye.